I'm going to talk to you about voice and natural language. I'm really excited about it. Thanks so much for coming out. Thanks for delaying your lunch by just a little bit. Just to tell you a little bit about me, why you perhaps should listen to what I have to say. My name's Dustin. I am the author of a book called Voice Applications for Alexa and Google Assistant from Manning Publications. That's all about how to build for voice on these devices, both from the code side, but also the UI and UX side. I'm the co-host of a podcast called VUX World, where we speak with people in the voice space, people from Amazon, Google, BBC, etc., about what they're building for voice, and then hopefully taking that information and sharing it along with you as well. And then finally, I work on voice search at a company called Algolia. We build search engines for websites, mobile apps, and increasingly voice and natural language interactions. First, we'll start off with where voice stands today and take a look at the ecosystem. And largely what we're seeing is that there's three main areas that people are building voice on. Certainly, this is not all that there is. There are certainly, for example, phone systems that are voice-driven. But when you think about developers, especially developers coming from the web who are now working with voice, it's largely in these three domains. You've got mobile, voice-first, and real-world applications. Now, mobile is where I suggest people start out. I suggest people start out here because they probably already have a mobile app or a mobile website, and it's easy just to put a mic on it, so to speak. Another benefit of starting with voice as well is the voice interactions here are not going to be so very different than how people are already interacting with your mobile app. Further, one of my favorite statistics is one that came from last year, so I expect the numbers to be a little different today, but it came from PricewaterhouseCoopers, who found that 71% of people would prefer to search through voice than use a keyboard. And that number is really incredible to me because we keep hearing about how voice is still in the early days, how we're just getting started with voice. And yet, 3 out of every 4 people would prefer to use voice to search. These types of interactions, like I mentioned, are going to be very similar to how people are already searching or interacting with text fields on your site or on your app already. So, for example, right here we have a query that someone may have typed, but it's going to be a little more natural language oriented because they're speaking through voice. But they might also ask for more detailed answer gathering type of questions, like what's opening this week. The next domain is the one that we probably hear about the most often, especially in the news, and it has a lot of sexiness associated with it, which is voice first. Voice first refers to these devices, these applications where you're primarily interacting with it through voice for the input and for the output. Obviously, the two big players here are Google and Amazon, Google with the Google Assistant and Amazon with Alexa. These types of interactions are going to be a lot more task-oriented. Now, these tasks might be the classic examples of play this music, turn on, turn off these lights. But often it might even be a task of get this information for me, like who directed Lady Bird, or something a little more open-ended, like I want to see a horror movie on Saturday. And then finally, you have voice in the real world. This overlaps a lot with the voice first, and it's what I'm most excited about because we're just seeing the start of this. This is really exciting to me because imagine you go into a hardware store, say Leroy Merlin or Home Depot in the US, and those stores can be really intimidating. I don't know about you, but sometimes I need to fix things around my apartment, and I'm not a handyman. I don't know everything about tools. I just know what I need, and I don't know where it is. But speaking to someone who works there can be quite intimidating because they know so much, and I'm afraid of looking foolish in front of them. So this possibility that I might be able to put or speak to some sort of voice application that they have in store and say, where are the nails or where are the hammers, and just be able to find that immediately. I spoke with a company recently who is actually doing this for wine and whiskey. And what happens there is these are two areas where if you don't know a lot about it, it can again be very intimidating because there's so much to know. What they're doing is they allow customers to go into the stores and say, I want a whiskey, and then discover the kind of whiskey that they can buy. They don't have to speak with anyone. That frees up those employees to do other things, and it allows these customers to have perhaps a more comfortable experience. As developers and as designers of voice applications, we need to think about the levels of voice. And I will touch on these briefly, but we'll come back to them again and again. These voice levels are more of a spectrum. So don't think that it's one bucket or another, but it really extends across this line. The first is voice only. This is where voice is the only input and output mechanism. You might immediately think of the Amazon Echo or the Google Home, but actually take a step back and think about it. When you speak with these devices, you get more than just voice back. You actually get that light on top as well, and that light is a bit of feedback. That light is a bit of output. This is going to be more classically earbuds increasingly have voice built into it. But again, it's a spectrum. Voice first is where voice is going to be the primary input and output mechanism, but you might have other modes associated with it. So for example, the Google Home Hub or the Amazon show, the Amazon Echo show, where you've got that screen output, but primarily people are interacting with voice, and they're primarily getting response back through voice as well. And then finally, you have voice added. This is where voice is an input, and it can be an output, but you have other modes that are predominant here. The classic example here is on mobile phones. Those, you have the screen so that users can always fall back to touch or to type, and that screen can also provide the output, where voice is maybe not the preferred output mechanism there. These different levels are going to inform how we build our apps and how we build our interactions as well. And our apps can go in between these different levels too. If I, for example, have my Echo show and I'm not looking at it, it goes from voice first to voice only. I want to talk very quickly about some of the interesting things, the interesting buckets that people are building voice today. The first is mobile app control. Whether someone's on the go or on the couch, increasingly they just want to interact with these apps through voice. So for example, Spotify is a perfect use case where you can play specific music or you can ask for a playlist. One thing that I really enjoy is Voice for Delight. There's a lot of voice games out there, and increasingly just these experiences that you cannot do without voice, and it adds a lot of fun to it. One of my favorite is this really small web app that Google built as part of their Google experiments called MixLab. And what you can do here is you can essentially build music by voice. You can say, add an 80s bass guitar, add a drum machine, add vocals. And through doing that, you can sort of the smile on your face where you go, this is quite fun. You could have done this through clicking on buttons, but it's so much more joyful speaking to something and hearing it respond back to you. And then, of course, there are voice for tasks. Like I mentioned, the classic example is a turn on or turn off the lights. But also, there are some cases where voice is just far and away better than tapping or typing. A company that we work with at Algolia is called WW. You probably know them as Weight Watchers. They recently changed their name. But their whole goal is to enable people to eat more healthy. And I don't know if you've ever been on a diet, but this isn't the most fun thing in the world. It's not something you really want to put a lot of effort into, or more effort than you already are. So what they're doing is they allow people to say, this morning for breakfast, I had 2 chocolate chip pancakes and a handful of cashews, and allow people to speak very normally. That takes a task that with a mobile app or website would be 10 clicks and brings it down to just 1, maybe 2 steps. So let's talk a little bit first about the voice tooling that's available to us on these different platforms. The first we want to look at is the web. Here, the web is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. The tooling for voice on the web, however, is quite immature. You have text-to-speech in all the major browsers, though I have to warn you, the voices for that text-to-speech is not very good. On the other hand, though, you have speech-to-text only supported in Chrome. Firefox is just around the corner, but Firefox has been just around the corner for at least a year now, so we'll see when that actually happens. My estimate, and this is just my estimate, is that by the end of the year, I expect most of these browsers, if not all of them, to have native speech-to-text. It just makes sense. All of these browser builders have speech-to-text capabilities already. They just need to add it to the browsers themselves. The one I worry about the most is, of course, Safari. So right now, it's only Chrome, except, unfortunately, not Chrome on iOS. So Chrome on the desktop and Chrome on Android are the only ones where you can do native speech-to-text. If you want to be in the other browsers, you do have to use a third-party platform like Google Cloud Platform or something like that. On native, there's not much to talk about here. Native is ubiquitous. We all have phones. And the tooling is ubiquitous as well. iOS, Android both make it really easy for both speech-to-text and that text-to-speech output. On the voice-first side, this is not nearly as ubiquitous, but it's growing very, very quickly. And there's, of course, robust tooling. And the primary players here are Alexa and Google Assistant, though there are some in-house systems, for example, in cars or on TVs. Let's look at an example of how someone might interact with a voice and break that down into its parts, because the things that we need to think about, the concepts that we need to know for a voice are a little different than what you have on the web. We've got, hey Google, ask Web2day to tell me what time Dustin is presenting. The first thing that we have is the wake word and the invocation name. Hey Google is the wake word or wake phrase, but this might also be okay Google or Alexa. As developers, we don't have control over this. But what we do have control over is that invocation name. You can think of this sort of like a domain name. It's how the users are going to ask for your application. The next is what time Dustin is presenting. This altogether is the training phrase. This is the utterance or the sample utterance that a user is going to say to trigger a specific action. In there, we have what's called a slot. You can sort of think of this as like an argument for a function. This could be Dustin, but this could be someone else's name as well. Altogether, this is an intent. An intent is what a user wants to do. And if an intent is what a user wants to do, I like to think of slots as to what or with what the user wants to perform that action. So here we just have it mapped out where intents have utterances and have slots, but we'll look at that more in just a little bit. The first thing we need to do when we're building an app is start to think about what users will want to do, and of what they want to do, what can we support, and where is voice better? Now, I'm a big believer in voice. I work on it all day. I work on it when I get home. But even I know that there are things where voice is just not well suited or not well suited today. For example, in chat and in forums, people are always asking, how can I get a set of numbers, whether it's a phone number or a security number through voice? And it's just not well suited to that kind of interaction, at least right now. There's too much room for misunderstanding. So you have to understand what you can do and what voice is geared towards. The best way to understand what users will want to do is to actually pretend like you are the app before you even start building. Google, for example, what they'll do is they'll have the designer of the app and someone who knows just the high-level detail about it. So let's say, for example, you tell them, this is a voice application for getting information about Web2day. You have them sit back to back. They're not looking at each other, because that way, you're not relying on facial expressions or hand movements or any of those micro pieces of communication that still provide information. That's not going to be something that you have when you're building an application. So you run through and you essentially ask them, what would you ask me if you wanted to find out information about Web2day through voice? This is called Wizard of Oz testing because you're essentially the man or the woman behind the curtain. Through doing this, you'll also develop those training phrases. And now this is how people are going to ask for that kind of information, those kinds of actions that you've just identified. You always want to start with voice when you're doing this. The way we write and the way we speak are very different. So if you're sitting there at your computer just writing out example phrases that people might say, they're going to be very different. You're going to miss ways that they're going to speak to your application. So you might get a list like this, where you have all of these different ways to ask for the same action. The next thing you'll want to do is you'll want to go in and you'll say, what's the variable piece of information here? Here I'm seeing names over and over, but I also see things like, when is the voice talk happening? This is a variable piece of information surrounded by more static phrases. And here we've got slots, and we'll look at that now. With slots, you're going to reference that by a name. Again, it's sort of like an argument name, and they're all going to have a type. And through those types, you need to provide samples. Those samples further are going to train the NLU and say, this is what I expect people are going to say. However, what we know is that when people speak, there's a lot of variety. And in fact, there's more variety when people speak than when they type. So names are certainly a good place to start here, but think a lot more broadly about it. People could speak through full names. They could speak through just first name. They could refer to someone by the title of their talk. Or even they could misunderstand or mispronounce a name. Or the speech-to-text could misunderstand it as well. So your job as a builder of these voice apps is to really understand human nature in a sense. Understand how people can speak and how they can mess up as well. And then finally, you've got the fulfillment. This is your code that's going to handle that information that you're getting from the NLU. The NLU will tell you, this is the intent that the user wants. These are the slots. Now I expect you to build that response. The way that I think about this is I think about it as a parcel going down a line. And essentially, at each point, it's looking at those functions and saying, does this handle this intent? Does this handle this intent? And finally, it's up to your code to build that response. As you're building the response, you want to think about 4 things primarily. You want to think about a lot, but it really breaks down to these 4, which altogether are called the Cooperative Principle, or Grice's maxims, after the person who created this principle. The quality is you've got to tell the truth. When we speak to each other, we assume that each of us is telling the truth. For example, if you ask me, oh, I hear there's going to be layoffs, and I say, oh, the weather is really nice outside, you assume that I'm telling the truth, and in the fact that I'm not responding to you, that's a response in itself. You would think that apps don't lie, but apps lie all the time. Apps lie by implying that they can do something when they really can't, or implying that they have done something when they really haven't. The next thing you need to consider is the quantity. And this is where those voice levels come into play. The amount that you want to say is going to be different if it's voice only versus voice added. With a voice added, you need to say a lot less because you have that screen to fall back on. With voice only, you might want to say a little bit more because you only have the voice output. However, you want to not say too much while still covering the response. So if someone were to ask, when is Dustin's talk coming up? And the response is, it's coming up soon, that's not enough. However, Dustin's talk is at noon on the 5th at the Accenture stage, and it's after this one, but it's before that one. That's way too much information. There is a middle ground where you give them just the right amount of information. And again, speaking this out loud, not just typing it out, but speaking it out loud will help you understand when you're hitting that sweet spot. Then there's the relation. You have to respond to the request. Again, we assume when we're having conversations that we are responding to someone's request and not just changing the subject. One way to do this is through confirmations, either implicit or explicit confirmations. How I decide between these two is if a user wants to perform an action and that action is going to be destructive in some way, or it's going to be hard to take that action back, let's go with an explicit confirmation. Okay, you want to transfer 15,000 euros to Dustin's bank account. Is that correct? There are other things, however, that are a lot easier to walk back. Oh, you wanted to play this song by Mariah Carey. I don't need to explicitly say that. I can just start playing the song, and if it's wrong, you can stop me. And then finally is manner. This is the maxim that is perhaps broken the most often when people build voice applications. And the reason why this is broken often is, again, because people are typing it at their desk and not understanding how people speak. When we type, we use more high language. We use very almost stilted language sometimes. Further, the talk will undoubtedly be, etc., etc. You want to use the same kind of words, the same kind of formulations that you would speak yourself. And this is a reason why it's so important to get either native or fully fluent speakers to build these apps as well. Because there are some turns of phrases, there are some slight incorrect formulations that are actually how we speak. What you also need to understand as well is that there will be misunderstandings. Either the speech-to-text misunderstands something, or your app can't handle it, or the user doesn't quite understand what the app can do. Because think about it, there is no menu. The user can ask for whatever he or she wants. You need to correct that. What I like to do, and what I think is a really useful best practice, is to have escalating corrections. This allows you to adhere to the maxims of relation and of quantity as well. On the first mistake, you just give a simple correction. That's not something I can do. What would you like to do? What can I do for you instead? On the second time around, you assume that they need more help. So you're going to speak a little more, give a little bit more information. I can give you information about this or that. What would you like to do? And then finally, on the third one, just tell them explicitly what to do. Say, hey, just try this. Finally, with discovery, again, there's no menu available, so you need to enable discovery. You need to empower discovery. Slowly reveal capabilities. One useful thing to do is keep track of what capabilities, what intents people are triggering. And if there's an intent that they haven't triggered and they've come back a few times, you can say, here's your information. By the way, did you know you can also do this? You're giving them the information at the right time. Again, adhering to that maxim of quantity. Also, you need to be liberal in what you accept. It is your job as a voice application developer to handle more of the work for your user. As web developers, as web designers, so often we have these bumpers that we put users into. We have those menus and you say, you can only click on this. That's the only thing you can do. Or here's a form field. Here's the only information you can provide to me. As voice builders, we need to understand that the user now has most of the power. And so we need to try and handle all of their requests as much as possible, even if it's simply to say, I don't do that quite yet. Here's something else you might want to do. And then finally, one of the most important things about building voice applications is the context. When we have conversations individually as people, we know things about each other. Even if we've just met, there are things that we still know about each other that helps that conversation go more smoothly. We don't have to set the table every single time. We don't have to say, okay, tell me your name, tell me where you're from, tell me everything about your life, tell me your interests. For example, We're all here at this conference. We all are interested in tech, I would assume. And so when we have those conversations, we can assume that we each are interested in tech, we each have a fairly technical background, and we can have a more efficient conversation based on that. When building voice applications, you want to learn as much as you can about the user as soon as you can. Take into account the recent conversations. What have they been asking you about recently? If someone is always asking for the same train, the next time they might just say, when is my train? You should not have to ask them again after they've told you 10 times that they want the one train. And that's where the personalization comes into as well. If you can map and say, you're interested in this, I think you'll be interested in that as well, that will allow you to more easily meet the request and also more easily clear up those misunderstandings as well. If I'm always asking for Mariah Carey and the speech-to-text all of a sudden thinks that I'm asking for Mary Carey, I can go, okay, well that doesn't quite line up with what I know about you. The takeaways here is that voice is growing. It's growing rapidly and it's growing everywhere. It's not just in our homes on these devices. It's on mobile apps. It's out in the real world as well. We need to understand as well the data flow. We need to understand how that request ends up with what we can use inside of our applications. And then finally, we need to remember the cooperative principle, remember Grice's maxims, quality, quantity, relation, and manner, as we're building those responses back to our users. Voice is growing rapidly, and increasingly users expect to be able to interact with your company, with your brand through voice. Right now, this is still the time where you can jump in there and be an early adopter. You can be someone who's building the next great voice app. But increasingly in the next months and the next year, it's going to be a very crowded space. So this is the time to start. If you have any more questions, if you want to chat, obviously I'll be around afterwards, but you can also email me. I love to talk about this stuff. So thank you so much for coming, and have a great rest of your day.